Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today and welcome to my talk. Today I'm going to share with you my journey of researching downgrade attacks on Windows and their severe implications on Windows' platform security. My name is Alon and I'm a security researcher at SafeBreach. I'm 22 years old and male self-taught. My main focus resides in operating system internals, reverse engineering and vulnerability research. And before joining the security field, I was a professional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athlete where I won several world and European titles. This is what I will be talking about today. We have a lot of interesting topics to cover, so let's jump right in. Starting with the research background. So first things first, what are downgrade attacks? Downgrade attack is the act of downgrading immune and fully up-to-date software to old and vulnerable software. And this act allows an attacker to expose past vulnerabilities in updated software and then exploit such vulnerabilities. My research first started from studying the BlackLotus UEFI bootkit. And what caught mine and everyone else's attention with BlackLotus was the fact that it was able to bypass secure boot on a fully updated Windows 11. But in fact, BlackLotus did not exploit a new zero-day vulnerability. Instead, it exploited an already known and patched vulnerability. And that was, of course, done by employing a downgrade attack. To give you a better understanding of how BlackLotus's downgrade was formed, to bypass secure boot, you first need to know what is secure boot. So simply put, secure boot is a security feature that is responsible to verify that each component in the boot chain is digitally signed. So it is very simple. If you're not signed, you're not loaded. The days of loading a custom bootkit by replacing the boot manager are gone. Instead, what BlackLotus did was to downgrade the Windows boot manager to signed but vulnerable version of it. And this allowed to then exploit a null vulnerability sourced in the vulnerable boot manager to then bypass secure boot. Microsoft's mitigation against secure boot downgrades included multiple actions, with the main one being revoking vulnerable boot managers and boot applications, and revoked images are, of course, not allowed to be loaded. But here comes the question. Are there any other components other than secure boot that may be vulnerable to downgrade attacks? My goal in this research was to evaluate the state of downgrade attacks in Windows and to find if components other than secure boot may have been overlooked. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with bring your own vulnerable driver attacks targeting third-party drivers. My vision was to target first-party entities, not only drivers, but even entities residing in a lower level than the kernel itself. My vision was to create a new category of bring your own vulnerable Windows. To kick off my research, I first had to form a reliable downgrade ability, which led me to define what would be considered a perfect downgrade attack. So first, the downgrade must be fully undetectable so that EDRs will not block the downgrade. And thus, I aimed to perform the downgrade in the most legitimate way possible. Second, the downgrade must be invisible. And so the downgraded components should appear up to date, even if technically downgraded. Third, the downgrade must be persistent so that future software updates are not overwriting it. And fourth, the downgrade must be irreversible so that scanning and repairing tools are not able to detect or repair the downgrade. Having the downgrade requirements defined, I then looked for a suitable component. But before I expose the target component, I want to ask you, what would be the least expected entity to perform downgrades? That would be, of course, Windows updates. So let's take a look on Windows updates and see if they can be abused to perform downgrades. The Windows update architecture is as follows. We have an update client and an update server, and they communicate over COM. For those of you who are unfamiliar with COM, this is just an inter-process communication method in Windows, and this is how the client and the server communicate. Administrator is usually forced on the client side, and trusted installer is always enforced on the server side. Now, the last piece and the most important one in the Windows Update architecture is that files once owned by Windows Updates are only accessible to trusted installer. So even administrator or anti-system cannot directly modify these system files owned by trusted installer. And this is where I found the first design problem in Windows Updates. Administrator to trusted installer is not considered a security boundary, and there are multiple working public proof of concepts of such elevation. So the Windows Update team attempted to secure the update process by enforcing trusted installer. However, since updates are only accessible to administrators, trusted installer is rendered completely ineffective. The only issue here is that administrators of trusted installer elevations are considered malicious and blocked by EDRs, which of course contradicts my first downgrade principle, which is being fully undetected. Now, I could, of course, try to bypass the elevation detection, which may have been possible, but then I would have to implement the downgrade process myself, which could still be seen as malicious. And so the best option for me was to find a flaw in the update process, which solves all of those problems. So let's take a look on the simplified flow of the update process. First, the client asks the server to perform an update given an update folder. The update folder is supplied by the client. Second, the server validates the integrity of the client-supplied update folder. Third, following the verification, the server operates on the update folder to finalize the update files, and these update files are saved to a server-controlled folder, one that is not accessible to the client. And so the client cannot, at this point, directly modify these update files. Fourth, the server saves an action list to a server-controlled folder as well, not accessible to the client as well. This action list is named pending.xml, and it contains the update actions to perform. So for example, it contains which files to update, the source destination files, etc. Lastly, when the operating system is rebooted, the action list is operated on, and the update actions are performed during the reboot. Now, the client only controls the initial update folder, and so I decided to look at this folder first and see maybe I can modify it, resulting in custom downgrading update files. As we already know, integrity verifications are performed on the update folder, so let's see how well they're implemented. The update folder contains update components, and each update component contains a manifest, MAM, differential, and catalog files. The MAM files are Microsoft Update metadata, and they contain metadata information, so component dependencies, installation order, etc. The manifest files contain installation-specific information, such as path, paths, registry keys, which installers to execute as part of the installation, and more. The differential files are delta files from the base files, and so a base file plus a delta file would result in the full update file. And lastly, we have the catalog files, which are the digital signatures of the MAM and manifest files. So catalogs allow signing multiple files at once instead of having the file that we want to sign embed its digital signature inside of it. In addition, the catalog files are digitally signed themselves, which makes it impossible to modify them or the files that they sign. So to recap, only the catalog files are digitally signed. The manifest and MAM files are not explicitly signed, but they are signed in the catalog files. The differential files are not signed, and the differential files also control the final update file content, which is very, very interesting. Is there any chance that differential files were left behind in terms of verification? No luck, because the expected update file hash is hard-coded in the manifest, and again, the manifest cannot be changed since it will break its signature in the catalog. At that point, I decided to look at the action list. I knew that I cannot change its contents directly because it is trusted installer enforced, but I also knew that the update process is performed over multiple reboots, and so I assumed that the state of this list is saved somewhere. And if I could modify the state, maybe I could control the update actions. And so I then searched the action list path in the registry, and I found this very interesting key named POQ_CMD line. It holds the executable that parses the list and the list path. And I then looked at the security attributes of this key, and I was extremely surprised to find that this key is not trusted installer enforced. And this allowed me to control all of the update actions. This is how the action list looks like in practice. It is an XML file that gives the functionality of creating files, deleting files, moving files, hard-linking files, creating registry keys and values, deleting keys and values, and much, much more. In order to downgrade, we can use the hard-link file action, and the source will replace the destination. To initiate an update, all that is needed is to set the trusted installer service as auto-start and add the action list and this identifier in the registry. The identifier is a dynamic number which is compared with the action list identifier. So the identifier is needed for integrity purposes, but since we control both the identifier in the registry and in the action list, we can just adjust them accordingly. And the most important thing is that none of these three actions is trusted installer enforced. And this allowed me to update the system with the custom downgrading action list. All of the integrity verifications are bypassed, since the action list is assumed verified as it is created post-verification. There is no need to perform the malicious trusted installer elevation. Instead, Windows Updates does all of the work for me, and this is a complete Windows Update takeover. Revisiting the downgrade principles. Of course, the downgrade is fully undetectable. There is no better way to downgrade Windows. In terms of invisibility, the system will appear up to date after the attack, as we basically updated the system and we didn't uninstall anything. In terms of persistency of the downgraded component, I found that the action list parser is not digitally signed, and so I patched it as part of the downgrade. And as a result, even after downgrades, even after the downgrade, when new updates are available, they will be falsely installed. So the patched version will basically ignore the action list and install empty updates. And in terms of recovery, the integrity and repair utility is not digitally signed as well, so I patched it as well as part of the downgrade. And the patched version will no longer detect any corruptions. With that, let's see the first demo of the day. This demo will demonstrate downgrading a kernel driver named afd.sys to an old and vulnerable version of it by using the Windows Update takeover, and then we will see how the same kernel driver is exploited to achieve kernel code execution. So first of all, we check the Windows version, and then we make sure that we're fully up to date and that we have no missing updates, which you can see. We'll then use SigCheck utility to check what is the current version of the driver that we are targeting, which is afd.sys. And you can see that it is fully updated with the version of 3.6.7.2. And just to make sure that it is fully updated, let's try to exploit a vulnerability sourced that was fixed and sourced in this driver. This exploit gets a process ID and tries to elevate the system by executing on the kernel. You can see that it failed, and that is because the driver is patched. So we'll now use Windows Downdate with a config file that will say downgrade the afd.sys driver to its vulnerable version. You can see the downgraded files. All we need to do is to restore the machine in order for the update to take place. We fast forward a bit, we'll log back into the machine, and we'll launch CMD again. Now we'll use SigCheck once more to see if the driver got updated, because the update was performed, right? And you can see that the driver is now in its base version, which should be vulnerable to the vulnerability that we tried to exploit before. If we check who we are, we're not currently system. We'll try to exploit the vulnerability once more. We get the process ID of the current process, and then we will execute the exploit. You can see the exploit succeeded, and we are now anti-authority system. Now, thank you all. If we check for updates, just to make sure that everything looks correct, you can see that we are still fully up to date, which is very, very interesting. So, what did we achieve so far? We gained the perfect downgradability, and we gained kernel code execution. Our starting point was administrator, so that was an administrator to kernel elevation. Now, administrator to kernel is not considered a security boundary on Windows, but gaining kernel code execution is still a threat, and of course, it gives much more functionality than administrator functionality. Although it is not a boundary, admin to kernel is still a threat, and a serious one, because nowadays, lots of users are still running as administrators, and running as administrator is the default on Windows. And as a result, many users could easily compromise the kernel, and this is an issue that Microsoft aimed to solve. Microsoft's solution was to deprivilege the kernel to make kernel access less valuable than it previously was. And this deprivileging was done by introducing a feature called virtualization-based security, or VBS in short. VBS, so what is VBS, first of all? VBS is a secure and isolated virtual environment powered by the Hyper-V hypervisor for the isolation. And again, the reason that VBS was introduced is because the kernel is assumed compromised and can no longer be trusted. There was a need for a secure place to implement critical security features and store secret keys. VBS features include the famous credential guard, HVCI, system guard secure launch, shielded VMs, and much more security features that really improved the security of Windows. And now that I have praised VBS so much, you may wonder how all of this actually works. So before VBS, this is how Windows architecture looked like. We've had user mode in ring 3, we've had kernel mode in ring 0, and then we've had the hypervisor running in ring -1. And with VBS, the hypervisor introduces virtual trust levels, or VTLs, and the higher the VTL, the more privileged it is. So simply put, VTLs are like virtual machines. Lower VTLs should not be able to access memory or compromise higher VTLs. Currently on Windows, only 2 VTLs exist. We have VTL 0 known as normal mode and VTL 1 known as secure mode. Normal mode contains the original operating system, and secure mode contains only the critical security features and mitigations, as well as key isolation technologies. And everything that is implemented in the secure mode should not be compromised from the normal mode, even if we talk about normal mode's kernel. Now, when looking at security features and mitigations, the first thing to do is, of course, to check if the security features can be easily turned off. I wondered if VBS features could be easily turned off. Since they protect from administrator, configuration modifiable by administrators would be ineffective, because then an attacker would just turn off VBS instead of dealing with it. The way that VBS protects such disablements is by implementing a feature called a UEFI lock. This UEFI lock is basically a UEFI boot service variable that holds the VBS configuration. If VBS is configured with the lock is the source of configuration instead of the Windows registry. And then changing the registry will have no effect. The UEFI variable is the source of truth. And of course, the boot service variable cannot be accessed in runtime from the operating system, but only during boot. So if you think about it, this is a very simple and reliable protection. Now, if the user really wants to disable VBS, he must load a custom EFI application signed by Microsoft. And this EFI would then ask the user during boot to physically approve the disablement. And only if the user approves, then VBS is disabled. Now, the key element here is that all of this is performed during boot, and the assumption here is that only signed code is allowed to run because of secure boot. The only signed code that touches the variable requires physical approval. So without physical access to the target machine, it should not be possible to disable VBS. With the ability to control any file on the operating system, I wondered what will happen if I try to replace the secure kernel or the hypervisor powering VBS with invalid files. So for example, files that are not digitally signed, attacker-controlled files. And I believed that the result would be the machine booting into the recovery environment, and that is because invalid files are a sign of compromise. Instead, I was extremely surprised to find that if the operating system loader fails to validate one of VBS's files, it will just boot normally, abandoning VBS. I repeat, if the operating system loader fails to validate one of VBS's files, it will just boot normally, abandoning VBS. And this can be used to disable VBS by bypassing the UEFI locks. As far as I know, this is the first bypass of VBS's UEFI locks, and it's also a very simple one. All we need to do is to replace the secure kernel or the hypervisor with invalid files, and it will work. Now it is time for another demo of chaining all of the capabilities gained so far together. In this demo, I will show credential extraction against the most restrictive settings, and those settings will be PPL enabled for LSAS with UEFI lock, protecting LSAS dumps. Well, then the next setting will be credential guard enabled with UEFI lock, protecting secrets in VTL1, and Windows Defender up and running. And the way that all of this will be bypassed is by first reverting the PPL fault patch to allow PPL bypass, second, disabling credential guard by passing the UEFI lock, and third, turning Windows Defender unfunctional by invalidating the main Defender executable MSMP engine. Now, just before I show you the demo, it is important to understand that credential guard and PPL for LSAS are complementary. If only credential guard is bypassed, LSAS cannot be dumped. And if only PPL is bypassed, credentials are encrypted and not usable. So this is what you will see if you try to dump secrets with a credential guard on. As you can see, the secrets are encrypted. So let's see the demo of bypassing credential guard, PPL, and Windows Defender all in once by utilizing the downgrades and the UEFI lock bypass. So first, we check the Windows version, and then we make sure that we are fully up to date and that we have no missing updates as you can see, we'll then launch sktool, which is a tool provided by Microsoft to see which VBS security features are running. You can see VBS is protected with the UEFI lock, and it is locked in UEFI. And also, Credential Guard and Key Guard are currently running, protecting secrets. We'll now use System Informer to see what is the current state of LSAS. You can see that LSAS is running as PPL. Lastly, we will try to copy malicious files outside of an excluded directory. And you can see that it doesn't work because Windows Defender is up and running, and we can't use these files. So now it's time to perform the downgrade and perform the attack. We will use Windows Downdate, and we will supply it with a config file that will say, downgrade the PPL fault patch, bypass the UEFI locks to disable VBS, and turn Windows Defender unfunctional. The tool is currently running. You can see all of the files that it is going to downgrade, all of the update files. All we need to do is to restart the machine in order for the update to take place. We restart the machine. You can see that updates are underway, or should we say downgrades are underway. We fast forward, we log back into the machine, and now let's launch sktool again to see what is the current state of VBS. It should have been protected by a UEFI lock. Let's see if it is still on. And it is not. The secure kernel is not running. Credential Guard is not running as well. So secrets are not protected in VTL1 anymore. Let's use System Informer to see what is the current state of LSAS. We can see that LSAS is still running as PPL, so this is something that we really need to bypass. And if we check what is the state of Windows Defender, we'll try to copy malicious files outside of the excluded directory. And you can see that the files are copied successfully, and we can now use them in order to complete the attack. So we'll now try to bypass PPL by using the PPL fault PPL bypass. We'll get the process ID of LSAS, and we will execute it with PPL fault. And PPL fault should have been patched in this system. Let's see if it is still patched. So the tool is running, and you can see that it worked successfully, and the dump file was created in the dump folder. If we now use Mimikatz to try to extract credentials from this dump file, we'll use the login passwords command, and credentials are extracted. These credentials should have been protected by Credential Guard. You can see that they are not encrypted. Now, lastly, just to make sure that everything is working as expected, we'll check for updates. We will see if Windows suspect anything. And it does not. Thank you very much. OK, so we bypassed the UEFI locks, we defeated VBS, we disabled it, but now it's time to talk about real security boundaries. The security boundaries that VBS introduces are any VTL0 to VTL1 transition is considered as an elevation of privilege. No VTL0 code should be able to compromise VTL1 code. And another boundary is ring 3 or ring 0 to ring -1, so any user mode or kernel to hypervisor is considered an elevation of privilege as well. Due to the way that VBS is implemented, compromising the hypervisor gives complete control over all of the VTLs. When looking at VBS downgrades, my main goal was to understand if there was a downgrade mitigation, such as versioning checks or revocation mechanism. If no downgrade mitigation was found, regardless of how far I could go with the downgrade, I considered this as a vulnerability. And that is because when new vulnerabilities will get patched in the target component, it will make the exploitation much easier. And even if not immediately exploitable, it is surely something that needs to get fixed. So firstly, I targeted secure modes, isolated user mode processes, and the most known one is Credential Guard, and so I decided to target it. Credential Guard is implemented as an isolated user mode process named LSA-ISO, which stands for LSA isolated. With Credential Guard running, secrets are stored in LSA-ISO in VTL1 instead of in the original LSAS process. And this is why dumping LSAS is no longer valuable, because LSAS only contains the encrypted blobs, and the real secrets are not accessible to any VTL0 code, as you saw before. I decided to target the downgrade with CVE 2022-34709, which is a fixed elevation of privilege in Credential Guard. I found both the vulnerable module, which is curl shared, and the vulnerable version of it, and downgrading the vulnerable module using the Windows Update Takeover worked well on a fully patched machine. And this allowed to escalate privileges from ring 3 VTL0 to ring 3 VTL1, compromising credential guard and all of the secrets it protects. There was no downgrade detection on VTL1 isolated user mode. Now, isolated user mode privileges are great, but I wanted to gain even higher privileges. So I then moved on to target the secure mode's kernel, which is more privileged than the isolated user mode. The kernel of secure mode is called secure kernel, and it is a minimal kernel that only implements the critical security features, such as HVCI, HyperGuard, and more. I decided to target this downgrade with CVE 2021-27090, which is a fixed elevation of privilege in secure kernel. The vulnerable module here could only be the secure kernel itself. But in this case, downgrading only the secure kernel did not work for me, and it didn't work. I've had to downgrade dependency modules as well, and only then it worked on a fully patched machine. And this allowed escalating privileges from ring 3 VTL0 to ring 0 VTL1, compromising the entire VTL and any of the mitigations that it implements, including HVCI, HyperGuard, and more. And there was no downgrade mitigation on VTL1 secure kernel either. Now, secure kernel privileges are awesome, but I wanted to gain even higher privileges. So I then moved on to target the most privileged entity of VBS, which is the Hyper-V hypervisor. The hypervisor is HVIX on Intel systems and HVIX on AMD systems. And the hypervisor is a standalone microkernel, which makes it a valuable target for downgrade. With the hypervisor, though, it was more challenging to target a specific vulnerability. And that is because many vulnerabilities titled Hyper-V elevation of privilege were fixed over the last few years, but Hyper-V is a very large component, and in CVE descriptions, Microsoft do not share which component in the Hyper-V stack is the vulnerable one. So it could be an elevated user mode process, it could be a kernel driver, or it could be the hypervisor itself, which is the only component that I'm targeting. Downgrading, so I decided to go 2 years backward to prove the vulnerability, and 2 years is old enough to be confident that there was at least one hypervisor elevation of privilege vulnerability unfixed in the old hypervisor. Downgrading the hypervisor and the hypervisor loader worked well, and the cross boundary here was ring 3 VTL0 to ring -1, potentially compromising the entire virtualization stack. This rendered the entire virtualization stack vulnerable to downgrade attacks. So let's see a quick demo of the hypervisor downgrade. So first of all, we check the Windows version as usual, and we make sure that we're fully up to date. We'll check for updates. You can see that we are fully up to date. We have no missing updates. We'll then use sktool. This time, we want to see what is the current state of the hypervisor. You can see that the Microsoft hypervisor has been detected. Current version is 22621. You can also see that VBS is running as usual. We'll use Windows Downdate with the config file that will say downgrade the hypervisor to a 2-year-old version. Tool finished to execute. All we need to do is to restart the machine for the update to take place. We fast forward a bit. You will see that updates are currently underway. Under the hood, the hypervisor is currently downgraded. We'll log back into the machine, and we'll launch sktool again. Let's see what is the version of the hypervisor and if it has been updated. You can see that it has been downgraded to the version 22000, which is the base version of a 2-year-old hypervisor. You can also see that VBS features are running as usual, just with an old hypervisor. If we check for updates, you will see that we are still fully up to date. OK, so overall, I found no downgrade mitigation in any component of the virtualization stack. The entire stack was found to be vulnerable to downgrades. Now let's talk about one last vulnerability that exposed all of the attack vectors to unprivileged attackers in certain scenarios. So it all started with this Windows.old folder, which I came across in some of my machines. And looking at it and Googling it, I found that this is the old Windows operating system, and it is saved for restoration purposes. So when you install a quality update, the old Windows operating system is saved to see Windows Old. And of course, the first thing I did was try to modify files inside Windows Old, but I noticed that access lists are copied from the old operating system, and so it was impossible to tamper with files that cannot be previously tampered with. The next thing I did was to check access for the Windows.old folder itself. And I found that as an unprivileged user, I have full access to this folder. And so the exploitation strategy is very straightforward here. First, renaming the original Windows alt folder to any name, and then creating an attacker-controlled Windows at all folder, and the attacker-controlled operating system will be used in case of update restoration. So in the restoration scenario triggered by administrator, the attacker-controlled operating system will be used instead of the backup operating system. So this is another way to perform the same downgrades from an unprivileged user in a restoration scenario. Closing remarks. Let's talk about the disclosure process, the next steps, and takeaways. Starting from the disclosure process, we responsibly disclose everything, and we notified Microsoft of our research findings in February 2024. Microsoft issued CV 2024-21302. This is Microsoft's official response to our research, and I would like to thank Microsoft here for the great cooperation and effort on these cases. Now, for those of you who want to further research the topic that we explored today, here are some of the things that I recommend looking at. First and foremost, the critical question still arises. Are there additional Windows features vulnerable to downgrade attacks? So far, both Secure Boot and the virtualization stack was found vulnerable. Do you have in mind additional critical features that you think may be vulnerable to downgrades? Another interesting feature introduced not too long ago is Linux virtualization-based security. And this is a game changer for Linux security. Would the same design issues exist in the Linux implementation? Lastly, are there any other operating systems, such as macOS or Linux, that may be vulnerable to downgrades? May the same implications on those operating systems be similar to the Windows implications? So what are the takeaways of this talk? First, the cybersecurity industry should raise its awareness of OS downgrade attacks and the danger that they pose. I found no mitigation preventing the downgrade of critical operating system components, suggesting that downgrades were not a focal point prior to my research. The significant implications of this research emphasize the danger posed by downgrade attacks. And again, while Windows is currently affected, could macOS or Linux be next? We need to address these questions before real attackers do. Second, design should always be reviewed and regarded as a relevant attack surface. The downgrade attack on the virtualization stack was possible due to a design flaw that permits less privileged VTLs or rings to update components living in more privileged VTLs or rings. So while VBS has become popular among security researchers in recent years with some really great research papers in the subject, this downgrade attack surface has existed since the beginning of VBS, when Microsoft first announced it a few years ago. This indicates that the design was probably not thoroughly examined. Third, in-the-wild attacks should always be thoroughly examined and expanded upon whenever possible. With the BlackLotus UEFI bootkit employing downgrade attacks, we realized that the concept of downgrade attacks was right under our noses. Although a year has passed, it seems that this time we were able to study and expand upon downgrade attacks before attackers did, so we expanded Secure Boot downgrades to the virtualization stack. But this is not always guaranteed, emphasizing the importance of studying in-the-wild attacks and always considering what other components or areas may also be affected by an attack. Before we wrap everything up, I would like to credit these talented people for their work. It was a pleasure for me to share with you my journey of researching downgrade attacks on Windows and their severe implications on Windows' platform security. Using the findings that I reviewed today, you can bring back to life thousands of old and fixed vulnerabilities. Windows Downdate essentially makes the term fully patched meaningless across any Windows machine worldwide. If you have any questions, please catch me in the wrap-up room and feel free to reach out on social media. And with that, I would like to thank you all for joining me today and have a great day.